The concrete mixer's engine roared like a beast in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah watched from her bedroom window as her neighbor Karen directed the workers, pointing exactly where she wanted the cement poured right across the property line. Right? Over Sarah's prize-winning garden? You want war? Sarah whispered, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. Then let's see how you handle what's coming. By sunrise, Karen would discover that some battles have consequences that last forever, and some neighbors know exactly how to bury their enemies. In plain sight. The first crack appeared in Sarah Chen's perfect life at exactly 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning when the concrete mixer's diesel engine shattered the suburban silence like a gunshot through cathedral glass. Sarah bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the gossamer curtains of her bedroom window, she could see the massive yellow truck parked in her driveway its rotating drum catching the early morning light like some mechanical beast preparing to devour everything she'd built. What the hell? She threw off the covers and stumbled to the window, pressing her palms against the cool glass. Below, a crew of workers in orange vests moved with practiced efficiency, unrolling hoses and setting up equipment. And there, standing in the center of it all, like a general surveying a battlefield, was Karen Morrison. Even from 2 stories up, Sarah could see the smug satisfaction radiating from her neighbor's perfectly postured frame. Karen's blonde hair was pulled back in, her signature tight bun, not a strand out of place, despite the early hour. She wore her usual uniform of pressed khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments. In her manicured hands, she held a clipboard in what looked like a property survey. Sarah's blood turned to ice water. She grabbed her robe and flew down the stairs, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floors. The front door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the windows as she charged across her lawn, the wet grass soaking through her slippers. What do you think you're doing? Sarah's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Karen turned slowly, a smile spreading across her face with all the warmth of a python sizing up its prey. Oh, good morning, Sarah. I was wondering when you'd wake up. I specifically asked the crew to start early. I know how much you value your beauty. Sleep. Get off my property. Now. Sarah planted herself between Karen and the concrete mixer, her chin raised in defiance, despite being outmatched by Karen's 6-inch height advantage and considerably more expensive wardrobe. Actually, Karen said, consulting her clipboard with theatrical precision, this isn't your property, not anymore. She extended the papers toward Sarah with the flourish of a magician revealing the final trick. I had the lot lines resurveyed last month. Turns out your precious little garden has been trespassing on my land for the past 3 years. Sarah snatched the documents, her hands trembling as she scanned the official letterhead and legal jargon. The survey map showed her property line cutting directly through the center of her garden. The garden where she'd spent every weekend for 3 years, nurturing each plant from seed to full bloom. The garden that had won her the Neighborhood Association's Most Beautiful Landscape Award 2 years running. The garden that had become her sanctuary after David left. The one place where she could find peace in the wreckage of her divorce. This is impossible, Sarah whispered, but even as she said it, she could see the surveyor's markers driven into the ground like tiny tombstones marking the death of everything she'd worked for. Oh, it's very possible, Karen said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, and perfectly legal. I checked with the city 3 times. I've decided to do a little landscaping of my own. She gestured toward the concrete mixer, a nice, wide patio, perfect for entertaining, don't you think? The crew foreman approached, a weathered man with concrete dust permanently embedded under his fingernails. Ma'am, we're ready to pour. You want us to start with the section over the flower beds? The rose bushes first, Karen said, never taking her eyes off Sarah's face. Make sure you get good coverage. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, like the sound of ice breaking on a frozen lake. Those roses had been her mother's cuttings from the garden where Sarah had played as a child, where her mother had taught her that growing things was an act of faith in the future. Sarah had brought them here when she bought the house, had tended them through 2 brutal winters and a drought that killed half the neighborhood's landscaping. You can't do this, Sarah said, but her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. Watch me. Karen turned to the foreman. Actually, let's make this extra thick. I want it to last forever. The first bucket of concrete hit Sarah's prize roses with a wet, suffocating sound. The white petals, still glistening with morning dew, disappeared beneath the gray sludge like stars being swallowed by storm clouds. Sarah watched her mother's legacy vanish bucket by bucket, her hands clenched into fists so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. Why? The word escaped Sarah's lips like a prayer to an absent god. Karen's smile widened. Because I can. Because you should have thought about property lines before you decided to play gardener. Because she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more violent than shouting. Because you need to learn your place in this neighborhood. The concrete kept flowing, burying the lavender that had attracted clouds of butterflies every summer, the tomato plants that had fed Sarah through the lean months after her divorce, the small herb garden where she'd found solace in the simple act of growing something beautiful in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything she touched. How long have you known? Sarah asked. About the property lines? Oh, I've known since the day you moved in. I had my lawyer run the surveys the moment I saw you planting. I've just been waiting for the right moment to ... collect. Other neighbors had begun to emerge from their houses, drawn by the noise and commotion. Sarah could see them clustering on their front steps and peering through windows, some holding coffee mugs, others already dressed for work. Mrs. Patterson from across the street was filming with her phone. The whole neighborhood would know by noon. Sarah Chen, the woman who couldn't keep her husband or her garden? You could have said something, Sarah said. We could have worked this out. Moved the plants, adjusted the borders, but where's the fun in that? Karen's laugh was like breaking glass. Besides, you really should have done your homework before you invested all that time and money in someone else's land. Due diligence. Sarah, it's a basic adult skill. The concrete had reached the section where Sarah's sunflowers grew, the ones that had towered 8 feet tall last summer, their faces following the sun across the sky like nature's own solar panels. She'd planted them the week after David moved out, desperate for something that would grow tall and strong and beautiful despite the darkness that had settled over her life. The gray sludge climbed their stalks like rising floodwater. I wanted peace, Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the rumble of the mixer. I just wanted to live quietly, tend my garden, mind my own business. Well, congratulations, Karen said, spreading her arms wide to encompass the growing concrete wasteland. You're about to have all the peace you can handle. Nothing but smooth, quiet concrete. No messy plants, no seasonal maintenance, no butterflies, or bees, or any of that chaotic nature nonsense. Just clean, permanent order. The foreman called out for the next section, and Karen pointed towards Sarah's vegetable patch. The neat rows of tomatoes and peppers and beans that had promised fresh salads through the coming summer, the concrete swallowed them with the same indifferent hunger that had claimed everything else. Sarah stood there for another 20 minutes, watching 3 years of her life disappear beneath the gray tide. When the last bucket was emptied and the crew began cleaning their equipment, she turned and walked back toward her house with the measured pace of someone attending their own funeral. At her front door, she paused and looked back. Karen was still there, hands on her hips, surveying her handiwork with the satisfaction of a conqueror claiming new territory. The concrete gleamed wet and ugly in the morning sun, a perfect rectangle of gray destruction cutting through what had once been Sarah's small piece of paradise. Enjoy your peace and quiet, Karen called out with a wave. I know I will. Sarah closed her door and leaned against it, feeling the full weight of defeat settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Through the kitchen window, she could see the concrete patio from a different angle, massive, permanent, undeniable. Karen had one, and they both knew it. But as Sarah stood there in her ruined mourning, staring at the destruction of everything she'd built, something else began to take root in the space where her heart used to be. Something that grew in darkness, that thrived on anger, that didn't need soil or water or sunlight to flourish. Karen Morrison had poured concrete over Sarah's garden, her sanctuary, her mother's roses, her hope for the future. She'd done it with malicious precision, savoring every moment of Sarah's pain like fine wine. Sarah walked to her kitchen, opened her laptop, and began to type. If Karen wanted to play games with property lines and legal technicalities, then Sarah's eyes burned from staring at her laptop screen, but she couldn't stop. 3 days had passed since Karen's concrete apocalypse, and Sarah had spent every waking hour diving into the rabbit hole of municipal codes, building permits, and property regulations. Her dining room table had become mission control printouts scattered across the mahogany surface. Like evidence at a crime scene, sticky notes marking crucial sections, red ink highlighting the most promising leads. Coffee cups formed rings, on documents she'd read so many times she could recite them from memory. Her normally pristine house looked like a war room, and Sarah looked like she'd been fighting that war without sleep or proper meals. But what she'd discovered was worth every bleary-eyed hour. Karen Morrison had made a fatal error. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 a.m., as Sarah knew it would. She'd been watching from her kitchen window, timing Karen's morning routine for 3 days. Coffee at 7:30, check the mail at 8:45, then the daily inspection of her concrete victory at 9 a.m. sharp. Karen was nothing if not predictable. Sarah opened the door before Karen could ring twice. Her neighbor stood on the porch in another perfectly pressed outfit, this time a powder blue sweater set that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly grocery budget. Karen's smile was the same predatory expression she'd worn during the concrete pour, but today it felt different, less certain. Good morning, Sarah. I wanted to check on you, make sure you're adjusting well to the new property lines. Actually, I'm glad you stopped by. Sarah held up a manila folder thick with documents. I've been doing some research of my own, and I think you're going to find this very interesting. Karen's smile flickered like a candle in wind. Research about your beautiful new patio. May I? Sarah gestured toward Karen's backyard without waiting for permission, brushing past her neighbor with the confidence of someone holding all the cards. They walked across Sarah's lawn, what remained of it, stepped onto the concrete wasteland that had once been her garden. The surface was smooth and gray, marked only by the geometric precision of expansion joints every few feet. Sarah ran her hand along the nearest edge where concrete met grass, feeling the sharp demarcation between what was and what Karen had made it become. "It really is impressive work," Sarah said, her voice carrying an odd note of admiration. "The crew did exactly what you ask, extra thick, built to last forever." "How thick did you say?" 6 inches. 8 inches throughout," Karen said, her voice cautious now. "Why? And you pulled all the proper permits?" "Of course. Checked with the city about setback requirements, drainage regulations, all those tedious municipal details." Karen's face went pale beneath her carefully applied foundation. "Permits? Oh yes. Permits are so important for major concrete installations, like this." Sarah opened her folder and pulled out the first document. "According to City Ordinance 847.3, any concrete pour over 100 square feet requires a building permit. Your patio is," she pretended to calculate, though she'd measured it obsessively for 3 days. "Roughly 1,200 square feet, which means you needed not just a building permit, but also a drainage impact assessment." "That's ridiculous. It's just a patio." "Is it?" Sarah's smile was sharper than broken glass. "Because according to the city's definition, any impervious surface over 800 square feet is classified as a major hardscape installation, subject to stormwater management regulations, especially when it's built without the required 3-foot setback from property lines." Karen took a step backward, her designer flats clicking against the concrete. "Setback? Oh, didn't you know? All permanent structures must be set back at least 3 feet from property lines to allow for drainage and emergency access." Sarah gestured toward the edge where Karen's concrete butted directly against Sarah's remaining lawn. "Your patio extends right to the property line. Actually, if we're being precise." She pulled out a measuring tape and knelt at the edge. "It extends 14 inches past the property line, onto my land." The measuring tape clicked as Sarah stretched it across the concrete, the yellow metal cutting through the morning air like a weapon. 14 inches of Karen's perfect patio sat squarely on Sarah's property, a concrete trespass that mirrored the garden invasion Karen had claimed to be correct. "That's impossible," Karen whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. "The survey markers are right there." Sarah pointed to the small metal stakes driven into the ground during Karen's property line survey. "I had my own surveyor verify the placement yesterday. Would you like to see his report?" Sarah pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of Henderson and Associates Land Surveying. The measurements were precise, undeniable, damning. Karen's concrete monument to her own superiority was built partially on stolen land, the very crime she'd accused Sarah of committing. "But my surveyor said," "Your surveyor measured correctly. You just didn't account for construction tolerances when you had the concrete poured." The crew went right to the stakes instead of setting back the required distance. "It's a common mistake, really. Expensive to fix, though." Karen stared at the measuring tape like it was a snake that had bitten her. "What do you want?" "I don't want anything. I'm just being a good neighbor, letting you know about the permit violations before the city inspection next week." "What inspection?" Sarah's smile could have powered the neighborhood streetlights. "The one I requested? You see, I was so impressed by your patio that I called the city to ask about getting permits for some improvements of my own." Imagine my surprise when they told me there were no permits on file for any major concrete work at this address. They were very concerned about unpermitted construction, especially when I mentioned the drainage issues it might cause for neighboring properties. Karen's hands were shaking now, her clipboard rattling like autumn leaves. "You called the city?" "Oh, I did more than that. I filed a formal complaint about unpermitted construction, trespass on private property, and violation of stormwater management regulations. Inspector Martinez will be here Tuesday at 10 a.m. Lovely man, we had a long conversation about the penalties for major unpermitted hardscape installations." "What penalties?" Sarah flipped through her folder with the casual efficiency of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Well, there's the base fine of $5,000 for unpermitted construction, another $3,000 for stormwater violations. The trespass issue adds another $2,500, plus daily accumulating penalties until it's corrected. But the real expense is the remediation." "Remediation? Complete removal of non-compliant construction, restoration of proper drainage patterns, replanting of disturbed vegetation to prevent erosion. The city requires everything be returned to its original state, plus upgraded to meet current environmental standards." Their voice was as smooth as the concrete beneath their feet. "My landscaper estimates it'll run about $35,000, maybe more, depending on what they find underneath when they start digging." Karen swayed slightly, as if the weight of numbers was physically pushing her backward. $35,000, plus legal fees. If you fight it, municipal court judges tend to be unsympathetic toward unpermitted construction, especially when it involves property line disputes. Judge Patterson, lovely woman, grows prize orchids. She has very strong feelings about people who destroy gardens. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the concrete battlefield. Sarah could see sweat beginning to bead on Karen's forehead despite the cool air. could watch the reality of her situation sinking in like water through cracked foundation. You planned this, Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. I researched this. Just like you researched. Property lines, due diligence. Karen, it's a basic adult skill. Karen's face cycled through expressions like a broken traffic light: rage, fear, calculation, desperation. What do you want? Money? I'll pay for new plants, replacement flowers, whatever. You can't replace my mother's roses. They were over 40 years old, grown from cuttings that came from her grandmother's garden in Ohio. Some things don't have a price tag. Then what? Sarah closed her folder and looked out over the concrete wasteland that had once been her sanctuary. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 3 sleepless nights and 30 years of being underestimated. I want you to understand something, Karen. When you poured that concrete, you thought you were burying my garden. But what you actually did was bury yourself, because every single bucket of cement you poured was a violation of city code. Every square foot of this patio is evidence of your illegal construction. You turned my property into your crime scene. Karen's clipboard slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering against the concrete with the hollow sound of defeat. We can work this out, neighbor to neighbor. I'll get the permits retroactively. Pay the fines. You can't get retroactive permits for code violations. It doesn't work that way. The construction is non-compliant and has to come out. Sarah's voice was gentle now, almost sympathetic. All of it. But the expense, the time my husband will? Karen's voice cracked like thin ice under pressure. Your husband? Sarah tilted her head with false curiosity. The one who doesn't know you spent $15,000 on this little revenge project. I imagine he's going to have some interesting questions when the city sends you a bill for $40,000 in fines and remediation co. The demolition crew arrived at dawn on a Friday, their jackhammers shattering the morning silence like artillery fire. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as Karen's concrete monument to cruelty was reduced to rubble, chunk by broken chunk. The sound was beautiful, the mechanical heartbeat of justice being served with interest. But Sarah wasn't just watching the destruction. She was photographing it. Every crack in the concrete revealed something Karen had tried to hide. Dark stains where the crew had poured over Sarah's prize roses without removing them first. Twisted metal where they'd buried her garden stakes and irrigation system rather than work around them. And there, embedded in the concrete like evidence in amber, fragments of Sarah's mother's ceramic garden markers, the hand-painted stones that had labeled each herb in her memorial garden. Sarah zoomed in with her camera, capturing every detail. Karen had told the concrete crew to bury everything rather than clear it properly, turning her revenge into an environmental crime that would add another $15,000 to her remediation costs. But more importantly, it gave Sarah ammunition for phase 2 of her campaign. The demolition foreman knocked on Sarah's door around noon, his hard hat tucked under his arm and dust coating his work clothes like gray snow. Ma'am, we've got a problem with the Morrison job. There's a lot of organic material buried under. That concrete looks like they poured right over a full garden without clearing it first. The debris is contaminated with fertilizers and pesticides, which means we need special disposal permits. That's gonna add about 3 days and another 10 grand to the job. Sarah nodded sympathetically while internally celebrating. Oh dear, I'm sure Mrs. Morrison will understand. She's very committed to doing things properly. Yeah, well, she's not taking it well. Been screaming at my crew all morning about how we're trying to rip her off. Even called the city to complain about us. Can you believe that? Sarah could believe it, because she'd been expecting exactly this reaction. Karen's privileged worldview couldn't accept that her actions had consequences beyond her control. She'd spent her life buying her way out of problems, manipulating situations through money and social pressure. But concrete didn't care about her designer clothes, and city inspectors weren't impressed by her husband's law firm connections. I'm sure you're just doing your job, Sarah said, following all the proper regulations exactly. Lady acts like we're making this stuff up, but contaminated concrete disposal is serious business. EPA don't mess around with improperly buried garden chemicals. After he left, Sarah returned to her surveillance post at the kitchen window. Karen stood in her backyard like a general surveying a lost battlefield, her perfect posture finally broken by the weight of mounting disasters. The concrete patio was half gone, replaced by a moonscape of torn earth and debris piles. The landscaping around the edges had been destroyed by heavy machinery, leaving muddy tire tracks where Karen's prize-winning lawn used to grow. But the real devastation was written across Karen's face. 3 weeks of sleepless nights had carved hollow shadows. Beneath her eyes, her usually immaculate hair hung limp and unwashed. Her designer clothes had been replaced by old jeans and a stained sweater that spoke of a woman who'd stopped caring about appearances because she had bigger problems to solve. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her friend Jessica, who worked at the bank where the Morrisons held their mortgage. Holy shit, Sarah. Karen Morrison just tried to take out a $50,000 home equity loan. Application denied. They're already leveraged to the max. Richard doesn't know about any of this. She's fucked. Sarah stared at the message, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and something that might have been pity. Karen had hidden the concrete project from her husband, funding it through household accounts while Richard traveled for business. Now the remediation costs were spiraling beyond anything their finances could handle, and she was scrambling to find money before Richard discovered her financial betrayal. But pity was a luxury Sarah couldn't afford. Not when her mother's roses were still buried in a city landfill. Not when 3 years of careful gardening had been destroyed by Karen's casual cruelty. Not when Karen had planned every moment of Sarah's humiliation and savored it like fine wine. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing the next phase of her campaign. The Willowbrook Neighborhood Association met the first Tuesday of every month in the community center, a bland beige building that hosted everything from book clubs to divorce mediation sessions. Sarah had never attended before. She preferred tending her garden to neighborhood politics, but desperate times called for new strategies. She arrived early, choosing a seat near the back where she could observe without being obvious. The usual suspects filed in. Mrs. Patterson with her ever-present phone for recording neighborhood drama. The Hendersons who complained about everything, from barking dogs to children's chalk art, and various other residents who treated HOA meetings like theater performances. Karen entered 5 minutes before the meeting started, her composure rebuilt through what looked like significant effort and pharmaceutical assistance. She'd managed to restore her hair to its usual perfect bun and had covered the stress damage to her face with carefully applied makeup, but Sarah could see the tremor in her hands as she took her usual seat in the front row. The throne from which she typically ruled neighborhood affairs through a combination of social pressure and financial intimidation. First item on tonight's agenda, announced Bob Peterson, the association president, is a complaint filed by Mrs. Chen regarding unpermitted construction and property damage. Mrs. Chen, would you like to present your case? Sarah stood slowly, letting the moment build as every head in the room turned toward her. She'd prepared for this presentation like a prosecutor building a case. And the evidence folder in her hands contained enough ammunition to destroy Karen's reputation permanently. Thank you, Bob. As many of you know, 3 weeks ago I discovered that my neighbor had poured concrete over approximately half of my garden. What you might not know is that this construction violated multiple city codes and was built partially on my property without permission. A murmur rippled through the room. Sarah had their attention. I've prepared a comprehensive presentation documenting the violations, the environmental damage, and the impact on our neighborhood's property values. Sarah activated the borrowed projector, and Karen's concrete disaster filled the screen in high-definition glory. The first slide showed Sarah's garden in its former glory, 3 years of careful cultivation, creating a small paradise of color and life. Gasps echoed through the room as neighbors recognized the transformation that had earned Sarah 2 landscaping awards. The second slide showed the concrete wasteland that replaced it, gray and lifeless as a parking lot. Mrs. Morrison claimed she had the right to pour concrete over my garden due to property line disputes. However, her own survey shows that my plants were within the legal easement allowed for natural landscaping. More concerning, her concrete extends 14 inches onto my property, making her the actual trespasser. Karen half rose from her seat. This is please hold questions until the end, Bob said firmly. Continue, Mrs. Chen. Sarah clicked to the next slide. Inspector Martinez's violation report, complete with photos and official city seals. The city has identified multiple code violations, including unpermitted construction, stormwater management violations, and improper disposal of organic materials. The base fines exceed $15,000, with additional remediation costs approaching $50,000. More murmurs? Louder now. Sarah could see neighbors calculating the impact on their own property values, imagining the precedent if people could pour concrete wherever they wanted without permits or consideration for drainage. But the financial violations are secondary to the environmental damage. Sarah clicked again, revealing photos from the demolition: buried garden materials, contaminated soil, improperly disposed chemicals. Rather than clearing my garden before construction, Mrs. Morrison instructed her crew to bury everything, including fertilizers and pesticides that are now classified as hazardous waste. Karen was fully standing now, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. You can't prove I told them to. Actually, I can. Sarah's voice cut through Karen's protest with surgical precision. I have signed statements from 3 crew members, confirming that you specifically ordered them to pour concrete over all existing vegetation rather than clear it first. You said, and I quote, "I want it buried so deep it never grows back." The room fell silent except for the hum of the projector. Sarah let the moment stretch, watching Karen's face cycle through expressions of rage, fear, and dawning horror as she realized how completely she'd been outmaneuvered. The environmental contamination extends beyond my property. Runoff from the improperly buried chemicals has affected the soil composition in at least 3 neighboring yards. Mrs. Patterson's prize orchids began showing signs of chemical burn 2 weeks after the concrete pour. The Hendersons' vegetable garden is exhibiting leaf discoloration consistent with fertilizer contamination. Mrs. Patterson stood up, her phone already recording. Is that why my orchids are dying? I've been trying to figure out what went wrong. The soil analysis confirms it, Sarah said, clicking to display the. Sarah's phone rang at 7:23 a.m. on a Monday morning, 3 days after the neighborhood association meeting. The caller ID showed her boss's number, and something cold settled in Sarah's stomach as she answered. Sarah, I need you in my office immediately. Tom Morrison's voice carried the flat, professional tone he used for terminations and serious disciplinary actions. And bring the Hendricks environmental file. The Hendricks file? Sarah's hands went numb around her phone. The Hendricks project was her masterpiece, 2 years of meticulous work documenting environmental violations at a chemical plant, building an airtight case that had resulted in $15 million in penalties and a complete corporate restructuring. It was also the most sensitive case in the firm's current portfolio, involving classified EPA enforcement actions that weren't public record. Tom, what's this about? Just get here now. The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Karen had threatened her job 3 days ago. Now her boss was calling an emergency meeting about her most important case file. Sarah dressed mechanically, her hands shaking as she knotted her tie. Morrison & Associates was a small environmental law firm that specialized in regulatory compliance and EPA enforcement. Tom Morrison, no relation to Karen, despite the surname, coincidence had hired Sarah specifically for her analytical skills and attention to detail. The same skills that had exposed Karen's violations were now being turned against her. The drive to the office felt like a funeral procession. Sarah's mind cataloged every possible attack vector Karen might have used. False complaints about professional misconduct, accusations of conflict of interest, claims that Sarah had used privileged client information for personal vendettas. Tom's office door was closed when Sarah arrived, but she could see silhouettes. Through the frosted glass, multiple people, which meant this wasn't a simple disciplinary meeting. Sarah knocked and entered to find Tom behind his desk, flanked by the firm's senior partner Janet Wheeler and a woman Sarah didn't recognize wearing a government ID badge. Sarah, please sit down. Tom's voice was carefully neutral. This is Agent Rebecca Hayes from the EPA's Office of Inspector General. Sarah's blood turned to ice water. The EPA's Internal Affairs Division only got involved in cases of serious misconduct, fraud, evidence tampering, violation of confidentiality agreements. Agent Hayes has some questions about the Hendricks case, Janet Wheeler said. Specifically, about whether you may have shared confidential enforcement information with unauthorized parties. I don't understand. Sarah's voice sounded foreign to her own ears. Agent Hayes opened a tablet and turned it toward Sarah. The screen showed a recording audio only, but Sarah recognized the voices immediately. It was her conversation with Inspector Martinez during Karen's concrete inspection, but edited to remove context and focus on specific phrases. I've been doing some research of my own. I called the city to ask about getting permits. Imagine my surprise when they told me there were no permits on file. I filed a formal complaint about unpermitted construction. This recording was anonymously submitted to our office, Agent Hayes said, along with documentation suggesting you used privileged knowledge of EPA enforcement procedures to conduct a personal vendetta against a neighbor. The complainant alleges that you leveraged your position at Morrison & Associates to access confidential enforcement protocols and weaponize them for personal gain. Sarah stared at the tablet, watching her words carefully edited and stripped of context become evidence of professional misconduct. Karen had recorded their conversation, then surgically removed every reference to property lines, concrete violations, and Karen's own illegal construction. What remained sounded like Sarah admitting to using her professional knowledge for personal revenge. The timing is suspicious, Agent Hayes continued. You initiate enforcement action against your neighbor on Monday. By Friday, you're presenting detailed evidence of environmental violations to a neighborhood association. The complainant suggests you used EPA databases and enforcement protocols to build your case. That's not, Sarah started, then stopped, because in a way, it was true. She had used her professional knowledge of environmental law to identify Karen's violations. She had applied EPA enforcement standards to analyze the concrete contamination. She had leveraged her expertise to build an unassailable case against her neighbor, but she hadn't accessed any confidential databases or used privileged client information. Everything she'd done was based on public records and standard environmental compliance procedures that any competent lawyer could have discovered. Sarah, Tom said, his voice heavy with disappointment, you need to understand how this looks. A senior environmental compliance officer uses her professional expertise to destroy a neighbor over a property dispute. Even if everything you did was technically legal, the optics are terrible. The complainant has also provided evidence that you've been using firm resources for personal matters. Janet Wheeler added, sliding a printed email across the desk. This shows you accessed our legal database to research property law and municipal codes during business hours. Sarah recognized the email she'd printed those property surveys and building codes on the firm's printer, had used their legal database to research Karen's violations, She'd done it during lunch breaks and after hours, but the system logs wouldn't show that level of detail. "We have to place you on administrative leave pending a full investigation," Tom said. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I know this isn't who you are, but we can't have our EPA compliance officers appearing to abuse their positions for personal vendettas." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. Karen had found the perfect pressure point, not just attacking Sarah's job, but weaponizing her own competence against her. Every skill that made Sarah good at her job, every piece of expertise that had exposed Karen's violations, was now being reframed as evidence of professional misconduct. "How long?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "The EPA investigation could take 6 months," Agent Hayes said. "If they find evidence of actual misconduct, you're looking at license suspension, permanent termination, and possible criminal charges for abuse of federal authority. 6 months without income, professional disgrace." Her career in environmental law permanently destroyed, Karen had found a way to bury Sarah's future as completely as concrete had buried her garden. Sarah left the office in a daze. Her security badge confiscated, her computer access revoked, her professional life suspended in bureaucratic amber. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the building where she'd worked for 3 years, trying to process the magnitude of Karen's latest attack. But as the shock wore off, something else began to take its place. Not despair. Sarah had moved beyond despair weeks ago. Not rage. Rage was too hot, too unfocused for what came next. What grew in the space where her career used to be was something colder, more patient, infinitely more dangerous. Karen Morrison had just made a fatal error. She'd escalated their conflict from property law to federal investigation, from neighborhood politics to professional destruction. She'd weaponized Sarah's own competence against her, turned her expertise into evidence of misconduct, used edited recordings and selective evidence to frame Sarah as the villain in their story. But Karen had forgotten something crucial. Sarah Chen wasn't just good at environmental compliance. She was exceptional at it, and the same analytical skills that made her a threat to Karen's concrete violations would make her a nightmare when applied to Karen's own professional life. Sarah drove home and opened her laptop, but this time she wasn't researching municipal codes or building permits. This time she was digging into Karen Morrison's professional history, and what she found made her smile for the first time in days. Karen worked as a senior marketing director at Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals, a mid-sized company that specialized in FDA-approved medications and health supplements. She'd held the position for 12 years, rising through the ranks from account coordinator to department head. Her salary was substantially enough to afford the lifestyle of expensive clothes and home improvements that had funded her concrete revenge. But Sarah's environmental compliance background had taught her to look for patterns, inconsistencies, violations, hiding beneath legitimate facades. And as she dug deeper into Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals' public filings, something interesting emerged. The company had been fined twice in the past 5 years for misleading marketing claims. Both times, the violations had occurred in campaigns overseen by Karen's department. Both times, Karen had avoided personal responsibility by claiming she'd relied on research provided by subordinates. Sarah pulled up the FDA's marketing compliance database and cross-referenced it with Pinnacle's current advertising campaigns. What she found was a masterclass in regulatory violation hiding in plain sight. Pinnacle's latest product launch was for something called Vital Boost, a dietary supplement, marketed to older adults with claims about improved energy and cognitive function. The marketing materials were carefully worded to suggest medical benefits without making explicit health claims that would trigger FDA scrutiny. But Sarah had spent 3 years analyzing corporate compliance failures, and she recognized the patterns. I am